Hi, I'm Brian Malow, and this is an interview following in the wake of the 2021 annual meeting of SigmaXi, the Scientific Research Honor Society. Their annual conference was just several days ago, and I participated in several sessions, and I wanted to do some follow-up interviews with some of the presenters and workshop leaders that participated in this year's meeting. And one of the most interesting sessions we had was about implantable devices and the ethics around implantable devices. And I'm very excited to be talking again to our speaker from the other day. So Katina Michael is a public interest technology advocate. And she worked extensively in industry before moving into academia. And she's widely recognized for her contributions to a better understanding of the impact of emerging technologies on humanity. She is a professor at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence. And she's the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective. Please welcome Katina Michael. Hi, Katina.
Hi, Brian. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to be speaking with you again. And that was a really interesting session. Before we dive into that specific topic, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. And I guess you're the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective. What is that?
This is a research team made up of about 13 people at ASU, many of them with cross-disciplinary backgrounds. So we've got someone from aeronautical engineering and also the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, people with a biomedical background and social sciences, people with telecommunications and social sciences, computing informatics and social sciences. And so we're a very transdisciplinary mob. And what we do is we investigate the intersection of society, policy, and engineering. And we were once dubbed engineering, policy, and society, and the team decided to flip that around and say, no, society comes first. Then we can be anticipatory and start to look towards policy and regulation to embrace our new emerging engineering marvels. So it's really at the focus, at the heart of our SPEC group is care, social justice, and environmental justice issues.
Excellent. And tell me a little bit about your role then as director and your background. So here we're talking about an analysis that of some technology and the ethical implications of it. But you have a background from the other side. You're analyzing the implications of this technology now, but you trained as an engineer first.
That's right.
And this is the kind of technology that you worked on, right?
That's exactly right. More specifically, embedded devices in 3G smartphones. I used to work for a company called Nortel Networks, as many of you would know, one of the largest suppliers of telecommunications equipment in the world during the 80s right through to the 2000s. While my background is in computing, telecommunications, dimensioning of networks and so forth, even business consulting, a short stint at Anderson Consulting when that was around, and also Otis Elevator Company in sort of your systems analysis field. I've matriculated through to what does all of this change actually mean for society, this digital transformation we're going through. What does it mean for us, for the future of work, for the future of people and humanity and the planet? How do we transition towards a model of sustainability? And so, you know, people might be interested to hear, I have a background in law as well. I have qualifications in transnational crime prevention. So I know enough about law, a master's in the law school at the University of Wollongong in Australia, to be dangerous, but then all within the context of responsible innovation, technology for the public interest. How can we use those tools that we develop and create and design a better way forward for us in the longer term?
Yes, maybe can you expand on this. I'd like to know something about your motivations. Did you always know you were wanted to go into the sciences? So I feel like there must have been an evolution of your motivations there from when you were striving to be an engineer and being an engineer, and then some sort of transition that like happens to so many of us, that moved to something adjacent to what your previous training was.
Yeah, I know in high school I had strengths in English and geography, topped the state in Australia for geography actually. Looking at how the world is changing, environmental economics was also another area I was strong in high school, but was drawn and attracted to the scholarships, as many of our students are today, in the field of informatics and beyond. And so I ended up getting a top spot in one of Australia's premier degrees in what I would call computing, maths, informatics, business. It was this milieu of subject matter. And we spent a year of the 3 years in industry while at university getting paid to actually study, which was phenomenal at UTS. But I always had this feeling of what does all of this mean? You know, I was one of those children, young adults, where I walk into second year university and somebody stops me at the bottom of the tower building, we used to call it, and said, Katina, you've got to go up to level 10. There's something called the internet there. And of course, we were talking about Netscape, Mosaic, and the ability to do WYSIWYG. But that's the era I grew up in. You know, I was the child that had the video games, available at their disposal at age 11 or 12, and then thought, wow, look, where's this going? Seeing barcodes go through the checkout for the first time, you know, not the ting, ting, ting that we all remember as youngsters, for example. But I was that generation that saw that physical transition and where was all this going? And so I think after leaving industry, you know, I never thought I'd become an academic. I think I'm the unlikely academic. It wasn't a traditional path. It was never on my radar, but my husband had encouraged me to do a PhD. Of all things, I ended up doing something in automatic identification as I saw things become miniature, small enough to be swallowable or implantable or corrective in terms of prosthesis, and thinking, where are we going with all of this? What's the trajectory? In the literature, it's called the technological trajectory. So to cut a long story short, as I continued through my path in the computing school at the University of Wollongong, where I was for 20 years, I started to feel this affinity with asking these socially responsible, ethical-based questions, and then moved into the legal space as well. Like, how far can we go? How fast can we go? And why are we going this fast? What's pulling us and motivating us towards this techno-utopianism or this technophilia or this techno-solutionism? Is it because it's easy on the surface, like the shiny gadgetry we buy for Christmas presents or other festivals? You know, why? And I've been propelled by that question since I can remember.
Yeah, and so now you're hardly a Luddite. You're an engineer yourself, and I suppose you are something of a technophiliac, if that's a word, I suppose. So you have this, is it skepticism? Like, you obviously have the love of the science and technology and building these devices, but you also have this, is it a skepticism, a cautiousness, or at least an interest in these other implications?
That's a great question. I mean, looking at the paradigms in the literature, you can talk about the precautionary principle. You know, that era of social informaticists like Rob Kling, the late Rob Kling, looked at, should we be really thinking before we roll out? And then you have the tinkerers and the experimental roboticists, for example, that say, just push it as far as you can go and let's see how far we can go and worry about those teething problems later. Society will speak up if they don't want to adopt. And then you have the Jacques Ellul's, the technological determinists. And then you have the amazing people like Norbert Wiener, the famous Norbert Wiener, the information control theorist, who said, it's great to innovate, but not to kill, not to maim, not to destroy. And, you know, in his Scientist Rebels, he describes how he was frustrated. And he said, no, we should not kill with our technologies. So all of this is an end-to-end design process, if we think about it in the lowest common denominator. And how smart are we really? Independent of the fact that our technologies are getting smarter and smarter, how is humanity going to invest in a future that is sustainable? And that's what it's about. You know, we once were cognizant of building bridges and doing the best that we could in building these engineering marvels to connect us. Then we built and laid out telecommunications, infrastructure, for example. And now that we have access, the question is, who has access? Where? What's the equity like? Why this discrimination? Who's going to hold who accountable? What are the processes that are transparent? And I think what I'm hoping for is a model that doesn't praise the techno-economic paradigm alone, that actually says, we're smarter than that. We can self-organize better as humans. We can provide access and openness to science and technology. And there are ways to do this if we embrace the fact that while everyone doesn't have degrees, they have a lived experience. They may not have the professional expertise to comment, but if there's a local issue, we cannot build on behalf of people anymore. We can't say we think this is in the best interest of you. Go ahead and, let's go and conquer. That was the colonialism that has us to the point that we are at now. Now, it served its purpose, but now where are we going? How are we more self-aware as a community? What is community today? And how can we ensure we empower people and not disempower them by the access or non-access that they have to tech?
This might be a slight reach, but you made me think when you mentioned Norbert Wiener, cybernetics, and I thought that it's almost a model or a metaphor for I've been having these talks about the science of communication, like with Dominique Brossard, and the idea of incorporating feedback. It's like it's almost metaphorically right there in the Norbert Wiener is like incorporating feedback in the process of science communication, in the process of science. And so let's move towards the topic that your presentation was about. I also, just because I don't always have an opportunity, I think people know that science papers often have long and complex names. And I just want to say one more time, the title of your talk, Embedding Human Values in the Design of a Technotherapeutic Implantable System for U.S. Warfighters, a multi-layered socio-technical inquiry from proof of concept to prototype and testing. It's quite a mouthful. Was this the name of just your talk for SigmaXi, or was that actually, is that close to the title of the paper? Or tell me about the origin of this talk, I guess. Okay,
the origin of this talk. Well, in January of 2021, I was approached by DARPA to be an ethics-based panelist. They call it ELSI. ELSI is an approach. It's not really a theory, but an approach to the study of emerging technologies. And it was defined during the Human Genome Project of the 1990s. So ethical, legal, social implications. And they asked me—
It's an acronym, ELSI. Ethical, legal,
social
implications.
And whereas the US have used that ELSI approach, the Europeans have taken on the ELSA. They talk about aspects. So we can guess what the implications are, but if we know about the aspects, we can sort of look on hindsight and say this is what happened as things are emerging and a nascent technology is diffused into society. So ELSI in the States, ELSA in the Europe, and that has sort of emerged now into the current milieu of time, talking about responsible innovation, RRI, responsible research and innovation. And now we're sort of coming to that fore where we say, okay, we've come out of this precautionary principle in the 70s. We've gone towards this ELSI approach used for technology assessment, perhaps in the 90s with the Human Genome Project. And then with the BRAIN Initiative and the BRAIN Project, we've gone towards responsible research and innovation as a paradigm. And now we're sort of going into this new space that's been dubbed public interest technology. In fact, I've pioneered the first global degree in a Masters of Science at ASU on this theme. It's actually called a Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology, which is really looking at technology for good. So we've gone through this phase, this period of time, and we're trying to look at how do we better not control our technologies, but shape them, be aware of them, be cognizant that they have impacts on people, on real everyday people, that if we do this, then this can happen. And while we can't curb all the unintended consequences, because many of them are beneficial unintended consequences, we can at least start to brainstorm very early on in the design process the risks that are there ever present before us. So if we do want to go implantable, what does that mean? For instance, now, just to go back to this DARPA adapter program, the first thing that caught my sight when the email came into my inbox was this notion of an adapter. I actually thought of an adapter, like plugging in something to a socket, like an RJ45 slot. And now I was thinking, well, plugging in something to us, and the answer is yes. This is the paradigm shift. Adapter, however, is an acronym. It stands for the Advanced Acclimation and Protection Tool for Environmental Readiness. And it's a technotherapeutic. It's not technology enhancement, as DARPA says. It's about technotherapeutics. There's no enhancement, according to them. The whole
I don't know if we're seeing it. I'm not really sure how, if we're seeing it, there's the image that you shared in your presentation.
And all the images I did share in that presentation are public documents. Nothing that I've shared is behind closed doors. I have signed a non-disclosure agreement about the technicalities behind the technology, but not told not to actually talk about the program itself. So the program has sort of two main aims, I would say. It's really about ensuring that we can do overcoming or meeting jet lag face-to-face. So how can we introduce an implantable device that can detect the circadian rhythms and influence the circadian rhythms through an implantable and in vivo device? That's called the NTRAIN device.
And is that by influencing it, is that by the administration of a medicine, a drug, or an electrical signal? It's an actual application. So it's an implantable device, and it's paired with perhaps an external device that might be on an armband or something, or a mobile device.
Yes. So the way it works, just generally speaking, from the images that you can actually see publicly available, there is an armband that's called a hub device. Below that is the implantable, roughly around the tricep area. The implant then communicates with the hub, and the hub can be tethered to a smartphone, a bit like how your digital watch is tethered to your smartphone. And so there is obviously some kind of detection that occurs about your sleep cycles and the circadian rhythm that you have. There are about 6 sort of individual things that make up our circadian rhythm, 6 factors, and you are trying to impact and influence them. So the one application is overcoming what's called shift lag or jet lag and through the NTRAIN implant. And the other one is eliminating bacteria that causes traveler's diarrhea from contaminated food and water. That is sort of the challenge of the warfighter. These 2 main things is this jet lag that most travelers in the world feel, feeling a sense of normality, and then the obvious one, which is traveler's diarrhea. So what the US defense doesn't want potentially is a force that's been deployed in a conflict zone, and the soldiers are suffering or living with conditions such as jet lag. You can imagine on the one side feeling like terrible because you're tired and sleep deprived, and on the other, suffering from diarrhea episodes, and the 2 make you dysfunctional. So you've been deployed, but here you are right at the front line with all of these issues.
So in your presentation, you had enough time to talk about this technology in depth, but I'd like us to jump to the ethical implications. And let me jump to the one that I know that I think you asked this hard question is like, is all this technology necessary to replace what up till now was getting a good night's sleep, or possibly some other way of, before I'm deployed, couldn't I get on the cycle for whatever time zone that's going to be in? Or, I think we all already deal with various solutions for diarrhea without implantable devices. We just take a pill for it. So what do you do with that? Did you pose, was that one of the central questions?
Yes, it was.
Is this even necessary? It's very neat technology.
Yeah. I think I gain inspiration from a number of biomedical experts in the world. I love technology. I don't personally believe that implantable devices, unless it's for prosthesis, your ICDs, your defibrillator devices, or other pacemaker devices, or deep brain stimulation as a last resort for those suffering or living with various conditions, such as major depressive disorder, for example, where drugs, they're resistant to drugs. I'm not saying for a moment that we should not be looking at technologies to aid prosthesis. I mean, look at the marvels of the cochlear implant, for example. Would I personally deny hearing to somebody who was hearing impaired? But then there are other people in the deaf community, the hearing impaired community, that say the cochlear was the worst thing that ever happened to our community because, you know, there's nothing wrong with us. This is just how we communicate. So I have my personal feelings. You know, if my child could have corrective or prosthetic surgery regarding a cochlear implant, as a parent, I would likely encourage that. But there are people in the hearing impaired community who would say, no, you know, damn the cochlear implant. But that's a whole nother area.
Sure, that's a complicated one, but surely the option should be available, I would like to think.
Yes. So
yeah.
With these kinds of emerging technologies, I did pose the question, what if you just look at analyzing the human body and how it best responds to different kinds of natural therapies? The wonderful Professor Christopher Timazio at Imperial College London often is heard in his talks. He's one of the greatest brains there are, but he always says the body is analog. Let the body do what it does best and interface with digital technologies. I'm pretty much of that school of thought. How can we best harness and exploit the power of technology on the outside? It's fine if it's worn, but when we talk about embedded systems, I do look at security from a computer science perspective. I look at security issues and other risk-related issues. I mean, infection is one of the biggest things with implantable devices. People that undergo deep brain stimulation operations often have to go back due to infection of the DBS, you know, in the head. So you'll find that in all the literature. You know, I'm not saying anything that's new here. So how do we avert misprogramming of embedded systems in the body, infection, side effects, other kinds of external factors? For example, in the future, we could have, you know, denial of service attacks, but denial of service attacks that render someone, who can't move because they're relying on a DBS stimulator.
Yes, or all of a sudden get this extra dose of whichever causes diarrhea instead of not causing it, or make sure you're tired.
Well, we know that, Brian. Insulin. We had the case, I won't mention the manufacturer, when the early insulin pumps came out, two people came closer together, both had insulin pumps, and one was sending signals to the other implant. So it's not like this hasn't happened before, right?
No, I have feelings about the whole Internet of Things. Like, I don't know. I don't think my refrigerator needs to be connected. I don't think my automobile needs as many, because, you know, cars got by for 100 years without having so many computers in them. And do you need to open up that risk? What's the benefit compared to the risk of being online?
Look at the cars that were taken over in experiments remotely, like the Jeep Cherokee experiment, where someone decided to take control of the wheel because of the computer interception, right? There's one example, but there are many of these. So who has
how much that's possible with technology that's in use today?
That was like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
You've taken over a Jeep Cherokee, put it down to a stop. It's on the internet. Have a quick search. So if a device, if a technology is internet enabled, there are ways through the wireless, and wireless is not a secure device. It's not foolproof, right? We all know that as engineers. You could never come up with a security protocol to completely avert all risks. So this remote kill switch capability, I can switch you off. It's a predatory security hacking in the future if we decide to place our embedded systems within the body. So if we can do this to cars remotely, surely we can do it. Like, there are people with DBS stimulators that walk into Best Buys and have the DBS tripped because there's an interception issue. Right? So they're walking into an inventory control system. They're going into a library and they go into a Prius car. They're driving. Well, the Prius has 8 computers. People with DBSs tend to refuse to drive for this reason.
What are DBSs?
Deep brain stimulators in the brain.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's to bring neurons and to stimulate them back to life. So people with these devices are cognizant not to enter fields, wireless fields, so they don't have their switch tripped. And basically, someone with Parkinson's may not be able to walk and talk at the same time if their DBS is off. They start to tremor with essential tremor, for example, and other conditions. So we have to think about these risks. And what you don't want is to increasingly place the US warfighter in greater risk, or at least if we decide this is the way to go, then we better have embedded not just ethical alignment, but privacy and security by design. That security is often forgone in the development of new technologies, not password protected, at the very least, not dual authentication, two-factor authentication, and beyond that, encryption. So if we want to go down this path, how much have our engineers thought about the security aspect? It's one thing to say this works, I've got the NTRAIN working. It's another to say it's secure,
Yeah, I just had a vision, like a scenario where a whole army is disabled at the press of a button, like they're about to attack and they're just disabled somehow.
Yep.
So what are some of the, we don't have a lot of time, but so security, that is a big issue. What are some of the other, and not limiting to the discussion of this device, but what other sorts of ethical issues? Do you have any other examples of besides security, what other issues are most important to you, and maybe some other examples?
Yes, privacy very much is important. At the moment, US warfighters are generally under quite a bit of surveillance. We've seen that demonstrated through various things such as surveillance of networks. So a US warfighter on an army base has a particular network available to them. It's generally secure, but through that, the analysis of behaviors, a lot of our US warfighters and US defense personnel have been in conflict zones, are living with various conditions, whether it's anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the biggest things actually today. We are monitoring actually our defense forces, particularly for looking at outlier kinds of behaviors that might point to suicide, for example, anger management issues, and other things like sleep deprivation. And now this is not really unique just to the US warfighter. These conditions are across the board, but perhaps exacerbated given the intensity of the average personnel officer. So the amount of surveillance going on and the consent of the US warfighter, it's one thing to say we've created a new technology, but where is the consent process? And how is that going to work? What if a US warfighter says, I don't want to opt into this kind of implantable device in the future? And not saying that it will be rolled out tomorrow or ever. This is, obviously experimental research with DARPA. That's why we talk about prototyping. It's just at the ideation phase. It's at the prototyping, and within about a year, probably will be at the testing pilot phase. And that could be in just animal experiments. We don't know yet whether it'll be in humans. But the question here is, what happens to those personal values? And we often look at the values of the defense force. And as we know, armies work as units. That's the whole thing. You go in and it's a group mentality. It's a pack mentality to survive during conflict. You don't want anomalies or people saying, excuse me, but I don't think this. It's you shall do this, because otherwise everyone is at risk on the mission. And so national security, of course, but what about personal security? What about organizational security? What about security of the family? Is this implantable device something that you can eject, when you feel like it, or is it in there for the duration of the time that you're a warfighter? And what does that mean for your family while you're on holiday? What does it mean for other civilians? If you're proximate to that US warfighter, what are the kinds of transactions that are occurring through these quite dull devices? They're proximity chips, to be honest. It's only between the hub and the implantable. But when we start to tether, what does that mean more broadly? Who has control? Is it going to be commercialized? Is this something that's going to be beyond technotherapeutics for US warfighters and find its way onto the shelves, inverted commas, in us? And what kinds of processes should we be preparing? So as a single person or a single team, certainly the rest of my team is not preoccupied with implantables. They're synthetic biologists, specialists, they're engineers in the sense of the environmental engineering, sustainability. But in my personal interest, in my research portfolio, implants has been one of these things. But the question is, who has control? What are the rights? And for how long?
when you're considering the aspects and implications of stuff like this, how do you talk about the idea that, sure, this one, it's like hard to argue with, oh, we're addressing two problems of sleep deprivation and diarrhea. But then let's say those are demonstrated properly, then it's not that big a leap to, well, there would be an ideal level of serotonin and dopamine in your system. And then that, I guess, slippery slope sort of thing. How does an ethicist address that? What is that issue of that sort of mission creep or something?
Yeah, scope creep, mission creep. It's been called very different things. All of this possibly creepy. If we look back at films, science fiction films that pointed towards a reality like this, like THX 1138, the George Lucas film, the transducer, and getting that level right for each person. Is that what our human well-being will be in the future? Fixes. We're going to fix everyone. We're going to fix them if they're too shy, if they're too nervous, if they're too neurotic, if they speak out of place, if they dominate conversations.
And if they're a soldier, what if they're not aggressive enough?
Yeah, all of these things, to reach what we call optimum, but optimum is for our tech. I don't really know about optimality in humans. Certainly, I believe in the human person, in uniqueness, in our traits and behaviors, in the person striving to fulfill what they feel that they feel their calling is on earth, whatever ideology or whatever religious affiliation or membership they self-identify with. But I think you raise a very important point about where to and why, and also whether we can prejudge ethics in the future, and whether we're going to go down this agile path which says, let's test, let's roll out. And one of my good friends, Professor Joseph Cavalco at Yale University, the chair of the bioethics research team, talks about death by internet. And he's a lawyer, he's a patent attorney, he's a telecommunications engineer himself. But he hit on something very important in discussion with me about 6-7 years ago. He said, Katina, as a patent attorney, I see a lot of patents coming through. And I said to him, yeah, I've studied IP for my courses in innovation. And we studied patent office files with patents approved and so forth. What if at the point of commercialization, we also had an ethics application? And it's very basic. Yes, we're looking for inventiveness and novelty and everything else that makes a new innovation new. But what if the Food and Drug Administration, for example, also introduced a parallel application process? Could we, and this is not about halting innovation, this is not about saying stop to science, it's more about being cognizant. Have we done our due diligence going through in the proposition of a novel new technology, whereas now we're just saying, we have empathy, we've defined the problem, look, here are the problems, let's go forward and experiment, right? This is what DARPA does as a living, as a process. But what if there was an additional injection of a continuous process? It wasn't just ethics at the start or ethics at the end or iterative, it was continuous. There were people like myself that had cross-disciplinary skills, overseeing, interacting with engineers on a daily basis. And we are part of the process. And in fact, you had civilians as part of the process as well. You had US warfighters from the beginning as part of the process through the design process, working together, deliberating.
Was this feedback solicited from you in this? Was that solicited from DARPA? Or
yes.
Okay, so it's DARPA working with a bunch of university partners, including Rice and Stanford, Northwestern. You showed that quite a few, and they themselves solicited this feedback from ethicists and about the implications and aspects.
Yes, but just to give you a view, and this is not a criticism, better something than nothing. But, in a whole days of presentation, we get 10 minutes each to talk, and there's only 4 of us. But that's still commensurate relative to the rest of the teams. I don't want to say anything negative there. At least we had 10 minutes each to speak, and the technical teams probably deserved a bit more, to be honest. The interdisciplinary teams, but interdisciplinary from an engineering perspective, not because they had sociologists on board or anthropologists or theologians to discuss these complex matters. But when you look at this, I get one occasion every 6 months to interface with the technical teams. And of course, they haven't barred us from reaching out to the technical teams. But if there's no funding adequately injected, because this is a voluntary role I've taken on, then how much can you do in your day with competing interests of your day job? So I would like to see, and I'm hopeful, if I'm here doing something related to ethics, it means somebody's paying attention. And definitely I can say the director of this program is certainly paying attention. He certainly said to us at the conclusion of our talks, look, thanks panel, there are things I'd like to meet again, and there are things that you raised that I hadn't thought of. And it's great that you have. And there are other things that you've said that I discount because we have thought of them and we've reached our own conclusions. But where is this assemblage? That's what I want to see. If my team is in the research team that I run is anything about, it's about roundtables, it's about stakeholder engagement, it's about user-centered design or human-centered design. It's about the lived experience and professional expertise coming together. It's about respect. We're not going to get wholesome technologies, let's call them like that, or provable tech or tech for good, unless there are more players at the round table. That takes time. It doesn't move fast and break things. It takes time. It takes budget. You've got to adequately buffer that budget in to incorporate these voices. And then you've got to see them through the design process, an auditable process of design that says, look, Katina, representing this stakeholder group, said this, and that person said that, and that group said that. And you're never going to get everything, being harmonious and equilibrium. But at least there's a trail of evidence that says we have taken in these pros and cons into consideration, and this is the best that we could do. We still believe in our product, our process. We've still come out with an implantable for sleep NTRAIN and for diarrhea aversion. But, live with it. And if you don't like it, okay. But where are we going to get more equity? And at the moment, it's all lopsided. We've got the big tech companies driving social media in a particular way. We've got big tech companies driving advertising models as if we're productized. We're not productized. We're not numbers. We're not cash, Brian. We're not things. We're human beings. And restoring that means we will only enrich the process of design.
Excellent. Thank you. It's good that, just like it's good to have people that, you bring all these different pieces to it because you're an engineer and you have a legal background. And so it's good that you're in that place, and maybe we can work towards that vision you have where it's a more common relationship. I want to thank you. And coincidentally, we're speaking on Veterans Day here in the United States. And you're teaching at ASU virtually, but you're not in the United States. People would not know that when we started this interview, it was only 5:30 in the morning for you in Australia. You're in Sydney. And what are you doing in Sydney?
So it's 5:30 the day after. So it's a Friday here in Australia,
right?
Which is crazy, from the future. But I left the States. My family's in Australia, in New South Wales. And just before COVID hit, I left the States and have been actually in lockdown for quite a bit of the last year and a half. Australians have been in lockdown so severe that we couldn't leave more than 5 miles from our home location. But I grew up in Australia. I'm an Australian citizen, and ASU has been gracious over the last 3 years to bring me on in this dual role to be a provocateur, really. And
what sort of classes do you teach in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence? Right. What sort of courses are you teaching?
School of Computing, right now we're in week 11 of 15 weeks in Smart City Infrastructure and Technology. I'm a co-PI on a National Science Foundation National Research Training Grant on user-centered smart city design and better living, particularly for seniors. And my class, made up of 30 PhD and Masters by Research students, are investigating dementia with respect to smart cities infrastructure and tech using a co-design approach. In my work in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, my teaching is on the public interest. I have taught classes in undergraduate, like Welcome to the Future, which is a very interesting topic to teach. But more now, traditionally, I'm going towards co-designing the future. This methodology that seems to be being embraced all over the world at the moment, being consultative, inclusive of various stakeholders. So co-designing the future in the public interest. Because I built the public interest technology degree, I'm very much in the role of technology assessment, looking at stakeholder engagement. How do we do public engagement like you do, Brian, with your science comedian work and science communications work more broadly? But it's that kind of thing. How can we create new skill sets that are much needed for translation, what we call mutual intelligibility? This translation, like, you know, you talk to scientists and sometimes they can't break it down, but we need to be talking in plain language. You know, often you're seen as suspicious if you're talking very simply, even in academic works, you know, but transdisciplinary requires us to redesign modern universities, what ASU is, a new American university, of which there are about 60 or so coming on board, to do what's called high bar research that's about sustainability, the longevity of the world and of people and of fauna and of animals, away from this, it's glitzy, it's techie, it looks digital. Okay, we're going to incorporate all of these things. We're number one for innovation at ASU, but how do we do it and drive towards that which matters? That's the whole thing. It's not about making money alone. That economic aspect has to be dealt with. Everything can't be free. You know, that's not the society we live in capitalist society and so forth, in modern world context. But where are we placing our efforts and how come? That's what I'm really interested about. And how can we better mobilize? How can we better coordinate as human beings?
Excellent. And, you know, those are some good forward-looking thoughts that we can end on. I'm going to ask you to hang out for a moment. I'm going to stop the live stream in a second, but I want to thank everyone for watching. And thank you, Katina, for participating in the SigmaXi conference and for taking the additional time to chat with me here today. And we'll have some more interviews coming up later this week. Thank you very much.
It's been a joy. It's been a joy to be with you. Thank you all so much for your interest.
Oh, if so, is there anywhere to point people for additional information on this topic in general, about you or the topic? Sure. I know you're at Katina Michael on Twitter.
Yes, and if you go to my website, I've tried to document things since 2015, katinamichael.com.
Excellent. Thank you again.